Hey. So in this video I'm going to talk to you about formal writing, and it's very difficult to talk about formal writing across the board because formal writing is a style, and as with all styles there are different degrees of formality. So what I'm going to do, and the first part of this video will focus specifically on some strategies, some stylistic techniques for formal writing as such that are going to be pretty broadly applicable. The second half of this video is going to focus more on some of the tools and techniques that you want to use if you're writing a formal analytical report for business. So for the project that my students in English 202D are doing right now, this will be useful for them. But for other contexts in which you might write, even in formal writing, some of the stuff in the second half is not going to be as directly applicable. So, to start off, this idea of formal writing, it's helpful to think about formal writing as part of a continuum of writing styles, from very, very conversational, might even call it slangy writing, although that's not necessarily a great term. But we'll go with that for the moment. From sort of slangy writing through what we would call conversational writing, which is basically sort of standard written English, but not formal. So more engaging, things like this. Up through formal writing, which is very linguistically conservative in some ways. It's very, it's in some ways an older style of writing, although I think we often think of it more as, an older style of writing than it necessarily is. But it's a very polite, formalized, detached style of writing. So, some of the characteristics of formal writing that you want to keep in mind. One, you're not going to be using first person. So, I, me, my, we, and our, you're going to take those out. In formal writing, you don't want first person pronouns. You want to present everything sort of third person. And part of the other part that goes with this is that you're going to rely on passive voice much more than active voice. So in conversational writing and in slangy writing, you may use a lot of active voice, where things happen. So the dog ran. Whereas in passive voice, things were done. So the dog was running, for instance. So that, I mean, that's a minor example of a difference here. But in passive voice, basically what happens is that you don't have a subject who's acting. You have an object that's being acted upon. So typically for passive voice, you're going to use a to be verb. So is, are, was, were, be, being, and been are the main to be verbs, the main forms of to be. So rather than something like, I saw X thing occur, you would want a phrase more like, X thing was seen to occur. So this takes out both that first person from I saw, but it also changes which verb is active in the sentence from saw, which is not the most interesting verb in the world, but it's a more interesting verb than the verb that's active in the second sentence, which is was. X thing was seen to occur. So in that case, the verb that's doing the work is was. So these are two of the things for formal writing. Is you're taking out first person, I, me, my, we, our, etc., etc., and you're taking out active voice as much as possible. So things did happen, things were occurring, as opposed to I did things, we did things, etc., etc. Along with this, specifically in terms of the formal analytical reports that you, my students, are writing, you're not going to be talking about your credentials. So that was a part of the topic approval proposal. That for some of you, that was discussed in the oral progress reports. For the formal analytical report, that is not something that you are going to talk about. So the idea here, and the idea really with formal writing in most contexts, is that the evidence proves the case that you're making. It's not about I have these qualifications or I have this particular interest in this subject, and therefore I'm reliable. It's I can show you concrete data, or rather, concrete data can be shown, because again, no first person passive voice. So concrete data can be shown to prove this argument. So that's the approach that you want to take. Other formal stylistic elements as such. Obviously, you want to avoid slang terms or colloquialisms. So if something, for instance, if something would be an effective solution to a problem, you would not want to say it's legit, or it's solid, or it's cool. You would want to say something more along the lines of, this would be an effective solution to this problem. So the language is going to be a little bit stodgier, it's going to be a little bit less hip and modern, but that's what you want for formal writing. Similarly, you want to avoid humor. So no jokes, no sarcasm, no nothing like this, nothing that's meant to be amusing, in part because it's not something that formal writing does, and in part because jokes tend to be culturally specific. And so you always, with humor, run the risk of your audience missing why a thing is supposed to be funny. And so that's something you want to be aware of. No cultural references, no pop culture references, no movie references, music references, things like this. Nothing that depends on your audience to know a particular cultural reference. Because again, if they don't know it, you're going to lose the value of that. For formal writing, you want to be, for the most part, using full sentences. You want to be using complete thoughts, with the exception of bullet points or numbered lists or things like this, which are not necessarily going to be full sentences. But the actual sort of body of your writing should be full sentences, should be grammatically and mechanically correct, everything should be spelled correctly, etc., etc. So that's all stuff that you want to do as a sort of baseline for formal writing. Now I'm going to shift gears a little bit to some things that are more particular, to some degree, to the formal analytical reports. So not all formal writing is going to do these things, but they're also not necessarily bad strategies in other contexts. So one of the things that you want to do for each major section of your formal analytical report is to give a preview and a review section. So that's a short section at the beginning that basically says, here's the information that you will get in this section. And then a short section at the end that says, here's a review, here's a summary of the information that you've just gotten. How long these preview and review sections are is going to be up to you, but I would generally recommend about 3 sentences, maybe, for most of the sections in the length of reports that you're doing. So remember, the body of the report should be about 10 pages or so. Typically, students end up writing maybe 3-page sections, 2-page sections. So in that case, I would say you want a fairly short paragraph, maybe 2 to 5 sentences. I'd say 3 is about the sweet spot. If you were writing a longer report, say 50, 100-page report, something like that, and you were using 10-page sections, you might use 10 sentences, somewhere around there, for the preview and the review. So you can think of this isn't exactly the same kind of thing, but a similar thing is the abstract for a scholarly journal article. So if I write a 22-page article, I may have 150 to 300 words for an abstract. So take that 22 pages, condense it down to 150 words. That's not all that unusual. And so that's the same kind of thing that you want to do here. Now, the reason you want these preview and review sections is to make your reader's life easier. Because if you remember, one of the things from our basic principles of business writing is that business readers fundamentally don't really want to read stuff. So if you can provide them a framework, provide them a sort of scaffold that's going to let them get the key information without having to read the entirety of a section, that's going to make their lives a lot easier. So the preview section, the review section, that's what these things do, is they give the reader the option to get the information without having to devote the entire time to reading the whole section itself. It provides a framework to make it easier for readers to skip or skim larger sections of text, which they will often want to do. So you want those sections. The other thing that you want to be thinking about, because you have multiple sections to this formal report, is remember, you have to establish that there's a problem. You have to assess what would constitute a good solution. You have to consider at least one, preferably more, possible solutions, and you have to make an argument for which solution is the best based on the criteria that you've established. So you've got multiple things that this report needs to do. So you want to be thinking about the transitions between ideas. And there's a number of different ways you can approach transitions. You can connect ideas. So if you end with a particular point, end with a particular idea, or raising a concern or something like this, you can start the next section by going back to that idea. So let's say, for instance, you end a section by mentioning the costs and benefits of your proposed solution. So you've given us an introduction to the solution itself, and now you bring up the idea of costs and benefits at the end to start supporting your argument. The next section may begin with a discussion of the costs and benefits. So that's one approach that you can take, is simply connecting ideas across sections. You can connect, this is, I think, a little bit more difficult to do, but in principle you can connect stylistically between sections. So if you end one section on a particular with a particular technique, like an anecdote or a piece of evidence or a statistic or something like this, you can begin the next section with a similar technique. So a similar anecdote, similar statistic, whatever it is. Probably the smallest scale transitions and ones that you do want are simple linguistic connectors. So this can be things like and, also, similarly, comparably, on the other hand, by contrast, things like this, that establish a relationship between ideas, either connecting them, contrasting them, whatever it is. So you want to be using those kinds of words as well to establish links. The other thing that can be tricky in terms of transitions is section headings. So you want section headings in your formal analytical report. Section headings can be a temptation to just sort of break a text and forego a transition. You don't want to do that. You still want a transition there connecting the previous section with that section. So you want to be thinking about how you're using section headings, but you also don't want to rely on them to the exclusion of transitions. So these are some of the things that you want to be thinking about as you're moving toward formal writing and moving toward the formal analytical report. No first-person pronouns. Passive voice more so than active voice. Minimizing humor, slang, cultural references, etc., etc. Writing preview and review sections to give the reader a sense of what's coming and to wrap up what they've just read. And then transitions to connect all of the ideas, all of the points, all of the stages of the argument together.